afraid of the dark.
Why do you think a skeptic refuses to believe and demands solid evidence until they come face to face with the supernatural? I think the answer is not difficult to find. The skeptic fears that acknowledging the existence of something beyond comprehension will destroy their entire system of evaluation and perception of reality. In other words, they fear the very pattern disruption and sudden fear that some storytellers spice their tales with. Here is my father's story about paranormal activity. In the first person.
The beginning of summer, the coolness of May, and a gentle breeze rustling the leaves on the trees. Sweet scents of jasmine and lilac linger in the air. A quiet country house, a modest two-story cottage shaded by tall birch trees and ancient oaks. We were invited here for the weekend. In this cozy and truly spiritual place, you immediately forget about the hustle and bustle of the big city. You feel like grabbing an interesting book, pouring yourself a strong cup of black tea, and settling into a wicker chair in the garden, completely immersing yourself in the surroundings. This is how I imagined old writers' country houses or artists' colonies. The day passes in the cares of grilling and chilling strong hot drinks. It's a soulful and blissful state of impromptu celebration. Can you expect surprises from this cozy place? You certainly can, especially if the person who built this house loved it so deeply and faithfully that even after death he cannot leave it. The grandfather of the current owner was a famous aviator, brave, strong-willed, and daring, a true hero of his time. He was strict and even despotic in the family. But like many strong people, the grandfather had a weakness. He adored his little granddaughter, protected her, and worried about every little thing, as long as nothing upset his little princess, Michelle. Life went on. Michelle grew up and inherited the cottage, built by her grandfather from the elders. For some reason, her parents did not want to keep the house for themselves and happily handed it over to their daughter, especially since such an option would please the deceased grandfather. Michelle's personal life was not cloudless. Her first husband turned out to be a rare scoundrel, and for some time the woman was forced to hide in this very house, under the protection of the family walls. Having told this sad story, Michelle added in a half-whisper,
Grandpa helped.
I noticed this and asked if a deceased relative could help their descendants, perhaps by appearing in dreams, or do their life and deeds serve as an example for the living? Michelle smiled sadly and, after a moment's pause, replied,
He comes around sometimes.
All right, metaphysical nonsense, that's what I thought. And a minute later I forgot about it because I didn't want to dwell on nonsense when my head was buzzing from the excess of oxygen and something stronger. I'll note that alcohol was consumed in moderation, and by evening, the last traces of the lunch libations had dissipated. Overindulging wasn't wise, considering I had to drive the next morning. The remaining time was spent in conversations and tea with spicy pastry. Our kind hostess provided us with the first floor, closer to the toilet and the stove, the place of the honored guest. You only understand this at night when nature calls, and you start feeling and listening in the pitch darkness for a secluded spot in an unfamiliar house. Closing the front door and turning off the lights in the rooms, Michelle paused at the doorway for a moment and turned back.
If anything seems strange, please don't be afraid. It's an old house here.
I must admit, this phrase made me stop and think. Nothing puzzles like ambiguity. What was it? A threat or a warning? Sleep came soon, deep and enveloping, as it can only be in the countryside. There were no dreams, just a peaceful, unburdened state of rest. My wife sleeps nearby. Michelle and the children, 3 boys aged 10 to 15, are upstairs. I joked all day that it was my harem. I'll sleep with my beloved wife, and I'll send the older one upstairs with the kids. There were no men in the house except for me at that time. I slept on my right side on the edge of the bed, facing the wall. Through sleep, I feel someone pushing me in the back, trying to wake me up. I open my eyes and can't understand. My wife is peacefully snoozing. Maybe one of the boys woke up and wants to be escorted to the bathroom. I ask how I can help, but there's silence in response. Unpleasant silence, oppressive, as if you've had a falling out with a loved one and you both stare at each other like two thunderclouds thinking of a nasty comeback. I repeat the question, thinking to myself, my son's never had sleepwalking issues, but Brad, Michelle's son, might well do. He's an emotional and active boy. I should gently wake him up and send him upstairs. Before I could finish my thought, heavy footsteps started moving through the room. They were unmistakable. I served my time in the army, and I won't mistake the sound of boots on a wooden floor. It was crystal clear that someone had entered the house and was now leisurely pacing by the stove. And if it wasn't the boys, then it must be burglars. He pushed me, made sure the only man in the house was asleep, and decided to quickly rummage through the room. Well, I'll surprise you now. I jump out of bed sharply, preparing to confront the nighttime intruder, and only manage to notice how a huge black shadow about 2 meters tall disappears into the wall. I turn on the light, check the entire first floor. I check the locks and windows. I don't find any signs of break-in or intrusion. Just to be sure, I go upstairs, and everything is calm there. I drink some cold water, look at the clock. It's 4:30 in the morning. Sleep has left me. I turn off the light. I return to bed with my wife, but I still can't fall asleep. And in the morning, I interrogate Michelle thoroughly. The woman paled when she heard about the black shadow. Then she apologized for her grandfather, who never left his beloved home.
He comes sometimes. If there's a man in the house, he comes to check who he is and whether he poses a threat to me or not. Like my ex-husband, he came to forcibly take me away from here when I filed for divorce. But at night, his grandfather drove him out of the house. He came, woke me up like you, and scared me half to death.
The quiet house no longer appealed to me. A sinister feeling emerged that someone was vigilantly watching and assessing every move, ready to come at any moment and punish for any mistake. And although we had spent the night there before, the house wouldn't allow me to relax.
The quiet house ceased to appeal to me. A sinister feeling emerged that someone was relentlessly watching and evaluating every step, ready to come at any moment and punish for any oversight. And although we had stayed there overnight before, the house wouldn't allow me to relax. Last September, on a Thursday night around 11 p.m., I had to go to the train station for work to deliver a package. My boss said I could leave the next day after lunch to get some good sleep and compensate for the overtime. I got back to my sleeping area around midnight, with no need to wake up early the next morning. I grabbed a beer and decided to sit quietly. I sat on a bench in the adjacent block from my home. I liked that place. It was never crowded. There wasn't much of a courtyard, just 2 residential buildings and a kindergarten forming a fairly large triangle, overgrown with trees. The houses faced this triangle with their back windows. There was nothing there, just a pathway where people walked their dogs, and a dovecote in the center of the triangle. Near the dovecote, under 2 old maples, there was a bench that was clearly not built by the district authorities. It was homemade, and apparently the owner of the dovecote made it to sit on after finishing his tasks with the pigeons. I liked sitting there. It was always deserted, no drunkards, quiet and calm, especially on weekdays. There was no one there that night either. I sat on the bench, lit a cigarette, and opened a bottle of beer. At first I didn't pay much attention, but I noticed that there was light inside the dovecote. After a while I realized that I had never seen anyone entering the dovecote or the light on in the evenings, although I often sat on that bench. I usually don't throw away cigarette butts right away. I extinguish them on something, so for a moment I lowered my eyes to put out the cigarette on the bench's support. When I raised my eyes, I saw a silhouette of a person in the frosted plastic window of the dovecote. I couldn't understand if they were facing away or towards me. I just saw a dark silhouette by the window. A couple of minutes passed. I took a few sips of beer. The silhouette didn't move. An inexplicable fear began to overwhelm me. The hair on the back of my neck literally stood up. There seemed to be nothing to fear. Perhaps the dovecote owner was a night owl, standing there, watching something. But some irrational feeling told me, run away from here. If it notices you, it will be too late. My heart began to beat wildly, paralyzed with horror. I couldn't move. By some inhuman effort of will, I managed to jump off the bench and run away as fast as I could. No one was chasing me. No bony hand grabbed my shoulder. I ran to the corner of the building, onto the sidewalk, caught my breath there, and went home. I almost forgot about the incident, considered it a normal panic attack, which sometimes overcomes you when you are alone in a dark apartment. But about a month later, I was having a beer with my neighbor, who, unlike me, knew many people in our area and was aware of all the news. I mentioned the dovecote in our conversation, apparently still under the impression of that night. The neighbor told me that about a year ago, the owner of the dovecote left his apartment. Where he was going, no one knows, but he always used to peek into his dovecote, even if only for 5 minutes. Since then, no one has seen him, and no body has been found. No one knows what happened to him. And the dovecote itself has been closed ever since, and no one uses it. Since then, I haven't sat on that bench or visited there at all. And a week ago in the morning, they found my neighbor's body near the bench, our domestic alcoholic. He was strangled with bare hands. There were finger marks on his neck. I hope the police find the murderer. We loved that man. He was a peaceful and calm alcoholic, a good man, and the police are working on it. The local officer came to me the other day, asking about the deceased neighbor. He also told me an interesting thing. It turns out that on that morning, the always locked door of the dovecote was open.